North Atlantic, winter of 1943. The sea is black glass under a vacant sky. Spray crashes over the bow of WW2, dissolving into icy mist that freezes on steel. Inside the narrow hull, red lights dimly glow on faces drawn thin by exhaustion. The men whisper little now. Only the rhythmic beat of the diesels and the slow pulse of fear fill the air. Then it comes. A ping, sharp, metallic, alive, cuts through the hull plates. It travels through bone and memory at once. Another ping, closer this time. The operator's hands tremble on the hydrophone controls. Every man knows what it means. Somewhere out there, invisible in the blackness above, an enemy destroyer has found them. The captain stands still beneath a low ceiling, hand brushing condensation. Orders are barely needed. Motors shift. The U-boat tilts downward, diving, groaning as pressure climbs. Somewhere above, propellers churn. Depth charges are being armed. In that pressure-crushed silence, each ping becomes a heartbeat of terror, a mechanical predator's call echoing through the void. That sound, the Allied sonar, would change everything beneath the waves. Long before those haunting sonar pings echoed through steel hulls. Germany's U-boat arm was preparing for a war its admirals believed would be fought invisibly. The Kriegsmarine, still rebuilding from the crippling restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, placed its faith not in battleships, but in the small, silent hunter beneath the sea. When Karl Dönitz, a veteran of the First World War submarine campaign, took command of the new U-boat force in the 1930s, he saw undersea warfare not as a desperate measure, but as a mathematical weapon. His idea was simple and terrifying. Dozens of U-boats working together, the Riddle tactic, or wolf pack, would overwhelm Allied convoys by sheer coordination. Dönitz's devotion to efficiency and discipline bordered on the religious. He called his submariners Iron Men, and they believed him. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began, the U-boat fleet was still modest. Only 57 operational boats were available, far too few for Dönitz's grand visions. But the reality of early British naval defenses, their scattered convoys, outdated anti-submarine techniques, and lack of long-range air patrols, gave those few submarines a hunting ground beyond measure. In the war's first months, U-boats prowled the North Atlantic, slinking between merchant lanes leading from North America to Britain. They operated mostly at night, surfaced, diesel engines rumbling as watch crews peered into the bleak horizon. The darkness was both ally and camouflage. Radar was primitive, and sonar, known as ASDIC, was still short-ranged, often unreliable in rough seas. When a target was sighted, the U-boat commander would maneuver quietly ahead, submerging to intercept. One precise torpedo salvo could send a 10,000-ton freighter down in minutes. By early 1940, the statistics were staggering. Month after month, Allied tonnage sank beneath the waves faster than shipyards could replace it. In May of that year alone, nearly 500,000 tons of shipping were lost. The British merchant fleet began to buckle under the pressure. Across the United Kingdom, fuel and food shortages became chronic fears. Churchill later admitted, in all the war's dangers, the U-boats alone had truly frightened him. Yet it was a strangely intimate kind of war. U-boat victories were often carried out in pitch darkness, unseen by the human eye except for the ghostly orange bloom of explosions on the horizon. Radio operators aboard submarines listened to British distress calls in languages they understood. They marked each torpedoed ship with technical precision in their logs, name, tonnage, coordinates, before vanishing again beneath the ocean. The soldiers of the sea became myth almost overnight. Nazi propaganda celebrated U-boat captains like Gunther Preen, who slipped into Scapa Flow and sank Britain's battleship Royal Oak in 1939, or Otto Kretschmer, the tonnage king, whose attacks crippled convoys from Halifax to Liverpool. Newspapers showed them as modern knights, lone predators defying entire navies. For young recruits, the U-boat service seemed a path to honor. For those who served, it was an iron coffin waiting its turn. Still, in those early years, the first happy time of 1940 to 41, the hunters ruled the Atlantic. Allied escorts were too few, and convoy coordination too slow. Submarines could attack, dive deep, and escape before ASDIC could find them. The cold water, layered by temperature and currents, distorted sonar pulses. Destroyers often wasted time chasing phantoms. German intelligence decoded shipping routes. Weather patterns hid U-boats among storms. Each success seemed to validate Dönitz's conviction that Germany could choke Britain into starvation. The war at sea might never require invasion or occupation. It could simply squeeze the island until it surrendered. But technological change was stirring across the water. British scientists were refining ASDIC transmitters. Coastal command aircraft were learning to spot periscopes, using primitive radar and lead lights. Industrial output in Britain, Canada, and the United States was gaining momentum. While the wolf pack celebrated their triumphs, their prey was evolving faster than they realized. By late 1941, just as German submariners toasted another year of dominance, unseen laboratories and shipyards across the Allied world were preparing the sound that would soon haunt them, the ping that pierced steel and silence alike. That transformation, the shift from hunter to hunted, would begin just as U-boats reached their peak power. When German U-boats seemed invincible, a quiet revolution was taking place inside Britain's coastal laboratories and naval control rooms. In the face of mounting losses, the Royal Navy began rethinking every assumption about undersea warfare. At first, the Allied response had been reactive: more escorts, more depth charges, tighter convoys, but the invisible enemy demanded something greater: precision, science, and relentless detection. The device that would become every submariner's nightmare had already existed in embryonic form since the end of the First World War. The British called it ASDIC, short for Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, the name of the group that first developed it. By sending out periodic acoustic pulses underwater and analyzing their echoes, operators could see beneath the waves, detecting metal hulls at remarkable distances. But early ASDIC sets had major flaws. They worked best at slow speeds, in calm seas, and within limited ranges, often less than 2,000 yards in the turbulent Atlantic. Temperature layers and depth gradients could scatter sound waves, blinding the pursuing ship at critical moments. Throughout 1940 and 1941, Allied scientists labored to strengthen those eyes of sound. Improved transmitters and more sensitive hydrophones expanded the detection radius. Crews trained to interpret the haunting returns, the difference between a school of fish and a man-made echo. Engineers experimented with new depth charge patterns, fuses, and sonar tactics that would stretch the U-boat's endurance past the breaking point. Meanwhile, the Allies reorganized at sea. Convoy escorts evolved from confused clusters into disciplined hunter groups. New ship types, the Flower-class corvettes, later the River-class frigates, were designed specifically for prolonged anti-submarine warfare. They lacked elegance but possessed stamina, able to remain at sea for weeks, rocking endlessly through gales while their ASDIC operators tracked the deep. Then came an even greater leap: air power over the oceans. The introduction of long-range patrol aircraft, like the consolidated B-24 Liberator, filled the deadly mid-Atlantic gap, once beyond aircraft reach. Radar sets began detecting conning towers at night, while searchlights known as lead lights painted submarines on the surface with sudden, blinding beams. The once safe nighttime surface transit, the lifeline that allowed submarines to recharge batteries, became a gamble with death. The turning tide was not immediate. In 1941 and 1942, particularly after the United States entered the war, the Germans enjoyed yet another wave of victories, the second happy time, as American coastal defenses were still uncoordinated. Tankers blazed off Cape Hatteras and oil slicks stretched across the western Atlantic. Yet the technological news continued to tighten. What made the sonar ping so fearsome to U-boat crews was not just its sound, but what it represented: the end of invisibility. Inside the cramped pressure hull, the crew measured life by machinery, the hiss of ballast valves, the whine of electric motors. The ping was foreign. It was the mechanical voice of the enemy intruding into their last refuge. Experienced commanders knew that once a destroyer locked onto them with sonar, time was measured in minutes before the first depth charge fell. To counter ASDIC, German engineers hastily developed countermeasures: the bold canister, which released a cloud of bubbling chemicals to confuse sonar, new hull coatings intended to absorb sound, deeper diving pressure hulls for survival below 100 meters, and improved acoustic torpedoes to strike back. The duel had become technological and psychological in equal measure. All along the British coast, Admiral Sir Max Horden, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, established highly coordinated escort routines. He rotated experienced captains who studied sonar traces like fingerprints, adapting to every German evasion. Ashore, mathematicians were feeding records of convoy and U-boat positions into basic mechanical calculators to predict where attacks would fall. The Allies were teaching themselves how to think like the hunter, even as they acted like the prey. By 1942, the picture of the war at sea was changing dramatically. Submariners who'd once surfaced freely began spending days submerged, rationing air and dwindling battery power just to survive convoy engagements. Exhaustion mounted. The numbers that once favored Dönitz's arithmetic of destruction began reversing. With each new convoy escorted by air and sonar, fewer merchant ships were lost. And where once only a handful of U-boats per month failed to return, soon dozens vanished without trace. Still, inside their bases at Lorient, Saint Nazaire, and Brest, German crews rallied for new patrols. Giant concrete pens sheltered them from Allied bombs, and propaganda films continued to show confident sailors boarding smiling and waving. But those who had already felt the ping in deep water knew otherwise. The Atlantic was becoming a trap, and sonar was the sound of its closing jaws. The stage was set for the inevitable confrontation, the moment when numbers, science, and fearless persistence would collide with the once invincible wolf packs. The decisive turning point was near. The war beneath the surface was more than a contest of ships and machines. It was a crucible of human endurance, tactical evolution, and raw psychological strain. To understand why the sonar ping struck terror so deeply into U-boat crews, we must step inside their world and trace the shifting angles of this invisible battlefield. A German U-boat in 1942 was roughly 200 feet long, barely wide enough for a man to stretch his arms across its center passage. Inside, 50 sailors ate, slept, and fought in air thick with diesel fumes and human breath. Water condensed on steel bulkheads, dripping continuously. Every surface throbbed from engines or the slap of waves against the hull. Sleep came in fragments, food and rations of gray bread and tinned meat. Yet, despite these conditions, morale remained paradoxically high. Each patrol returned with songs, decorations, and glowing reports from Berlin. They were told they were the tip of the spear, the decisive force starting Britain into surrender. And so, when the sonar pings first echoed through the hull, disbelief often came before fear. Machines, they thought, could not outwit them. But over time, the psychological erosion was relentless. A single attack could last 12 hours or more, destroyers circling above, sonar beams sweeping the depths, and the crew listening to each metallic ping grow sharper, closer. The air pressure built up, oxygen dwindled, carbon dioxide rose until men hallucinated strange sounds. Nerves frayed. At the command, Silent running. Every man froze, holding even coughs, terrified that a loose wrench or dropped spanner might betray them. Living for weeks in such dread left scars that ordinary victory parades could never erase. When survivors of sunk submarines were later interviewed, many spoke first not of explosions, but of sound, the cold, mathematical rhythm of the pings that told them death was listening. Dönitz's riddle tactic was revolutionary in concept and ruthless in execution. Rather than single submarines hunting alone, multiple boats patrolled assigned lines across the North Atlantic. When one sighted a convoy, it shadowed from distance, transmitting its position by radio to headquarters. Dönitz's command staff then diverted other boats to converge like wolves encircling prey. At night, the surface attacks began. U-boats, running low on the water, approached from multiple directions. They fired torpedoes by visual aim and fled into the darkness. This swarm tactic overwhelmed convoys, whose escorts were too few and too scattered. In the early years, it worked devastatingly well. Entire convoys were annihilated in coordinated assaults, with little risk to the submarines themselves. But the tactic had an Achilles heel: communication. Those radio signals that kept wolf packs organized could also be intercepted. British intelligence at Bletchley Park was slowly cracking the Enigma code, gaining fragments of German message traffic. With each broken cipher, convoys could be rerouted away from ambushes. What Dönitz saw as the ultimate coordination tool became an unwitting beacon to his enemies. As Allied technology advanced, so too did their convoy discipline. Escorts learned to operate not defensively but as hunters themselves, using sonar to triangulate depth and speed. Instead of chasing faint echoes blindly, they used mathematical plotting to predict submarine maneuvers. When the first depth charges exploded above them, U-boat skippers faced near impossible choices: dive deeper and risk crushing pressure, or surface and face aircraft waiting overhead. By 1943, the once effective Wolfpack tactic turned suicidal. The more submarines that gathered, the more sonar targets the Allies could detect. Pings multiplied, depth charges cascaded, and coordination dissolved into chaos. The hunters' confidence waned. Silence replaced bravado. Crews whispered during meals, eyes fixed on condensation dripping from pipes. They counted their own heartbeat between sonar pulses. Even the crackle of the onboard radio became a source of dread, for intercepted or delayed messages often meant the Wolfpack was walking into a trap. By that point, Dönitz's iron men had become ghosts of an earlier optimism. The same oceans they had once ruled unchallenged were now alive with mechanical eyes, and the sound that meant only one thing: discovery. Each layer of innovation and counter-innovation had altered the Atlantic battlefield. But beneath the strategy and technology, the psychological war grew heavier with every patrol. The oceans were still vast, but there was nowhere left to hide when sound itself betrayed you. Next come the other perspectives: the Allied advances in technology and the moral and leadership tensions on both sides, showing how the desperate duel of sonar and steel reached its fever pitch. The undersea war had become a contest not of strength, but of perception: who could see first, and who could strike unseen. By late 1942, Allied laboratories in Britain, Canada, and the United States were transforming that race into a triumph of engineering. Sonar, ASDIC, was no longer an experimental novelty. It had matured into a disciplined instrument of war. The pulse emitters grew more powerful, the oscillators tuned to finer frequencies. Crews trained to read patterns in their headphones the way musicians hear tone and pitch. A dull, soft return meant seaweed or current. A sharp, metallic echo signaled steel. Ping! Pause. Ping! And those intervals revealed distance and movement. The sea itself became a three-dimensional map of sound. At the same time, radar coverage spread like a net across the surface world. While sonar hunted beneath the waves, centimetric radar, newly fitted to aircraft and destroyers, hunted above them. The two systems complemented one another. When a submarine surfaced to charge batteries, radar found it. When it dived, sonar finished the chase. The combination crushed the once secure rhythm of the U-boat's life cycle. The brief sunlight, the fresh air gone in seconds as the alarm bell sent men plunging below again. Technicians also refined the weapon that completed this closed circuit, the depth charge. Early charges had been crude, exploding at guess depths. By 1943, creeping attack methods, in which one ship maintained sonar contact while another advanced silently to deliver ordnance, brought astonishing effectiveness. Later still, Hedgehog mortars fired patterns of forward-thrown bombs that detonated only upon impact, enabling continuous sonar contact during the attack. The ocean, long the friend of concealment, had turned against the submariner. Every new waveform, every improvement in signal clarity, stripped away another layer of darkness. To the Allied sailor, the ping was reassurance, proof that the invisible enemy could be found. To the German beneath, it was revelation of betrayal, proof that the sea no longer kept secrets. At the center of the German effort, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz carried both pride and despair. By 1943, his once exultant fleet reports grew grim. He shifted tone in speeches, fewer boasts of victory, more appeals to endurance. The crews reverenced him almost as a father figure. He visited bases personally, shaking hands before every patrol, promising that new technologies, the acoustic torpedo, the snorkel, the revolutionary Type XXI electroboat, would reverse their fortune. In truth, most of these innovations arrived too late. Dönitz's strategic mind was coldly mathematical. He calculated tonnage sunk versus tonnage built, convinced that if Germany could destroy 700,000 tons of Allied shipping monthly, Britain would falter. But by mid-1943 the equation collapsed. Allied shipyards now launched vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. Technology had shifted the balance beyond any willpower or arithmetic. Across the ocean, Admiral Sir Max Horton, who commanded the western approaches, represented the opposite philosophy, decentralized command. Where Dönitz coordinated from afar, Horton delegated to escort group captains, urging initiative and experimentation. He turned the convoy system into a living organism, its escorts communicating by disciplined shorthand, adapting instantly to sonar contacts. Under his stewardship, the Allies learned to exploit morale as well as tactics. The knowledge that their technology worked, that their ping was truth rather than guesswork, kept spirits high amid gray seas and long watches. And then came the moral weight. It was not lost on either side that these confrontations were profoundly unequal by the war's end. A sonar contact meant men trapped hundreds of feet below, breathing foul air, waiting for the noise that meant rupture and flooding. Allied commanders recorded moments of unease. Some hesitated to deliver the coup de grace once a submarine was clearly beaten. Others rationalized that every U-boat meant hundreds of merchant sailors' lives spared. Morality warped under pressure. Compassion could paralyze command, and command could not afford paralysis. For the German sailors, faith became their final refuge. Some prayed under their breath after each ping. Others cursed Dönitz, the sea, or luck itself. Nearly all kept silent about fear. Letters to families were brief, censored, and eerily calm. Only their diaries, recovered decades later, revealed quiet confessions. "The sound is everywhere," one wrote. "It is inside the boat, inside my skull. It follows even into dreams." By 1943, these intertwined threads, human endurance, tactical obsession, scientific precision, and moral fatigue, coiled tighter and tighter around the same moment in history. The contest could not hold its balance much longer. Something had to break, and when it did, the entire Atlantic War would tilt irrevocably toward one side. That breaking point was May 1943, Black May, when the ocean itself seemed to turn against the hunters. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic trembled with a new rhythm. The Germans still called it der Atlantikschlacht, the Battle of the Atlantic, but the battle lines had shifted beneath their very hulls. What had begun as a realm of stealth and mastery for the U-boats was now a gauntlet of glass. Every patrol meant the same whispering question passed between the men in cramped bunks. Will we come back? From February to May, casualty reports reached Dönitz's desk with grim regularity. Each morning, he reviewed decoded signals. Another U-boat overdue, another gone. Without contact. The figures grew unbearable. 50 boats lost in March. 70 in April. In May 1943, the number would reach 41 in a single month, a figure that shattered the fleet's morale and would forever mark the turning point of the U-boat war. The Germans called it Schwarzer, Black May. The opening scene of that catastrophe took shape along the convoy routes radiating from the North American coast. Convoy ONS-5, 42 merchant ships guarded by escorts, steamed toward Liverpool through storms, sleet, and fog. 25 U-boats converged, forming one of the last great wolf-pack deployments of the war. For days, they played cat and mouse with the convoy, torpedoes striking stragglers in the night. But the escorts were no longer the fragile defenders of 1941. They had become coordinated hunters. At first light, sonar pings rippled through the gray Atlantic swells in a chorus of precision. HMS Tay, HMS Duncan, and HMS Snowflake tracked multiple contacts. Radar aboard aircraft overhead confirmed positions. Each time a U-boat surfaced to reposition, a Liberator swooped in, dropping depth charges with deadly accuracy. The Wolfpack was being dissected in real time, its stealth turned into illumination. Within 48 hours, 6 U-boats were destroyed, several more badly damaged. The survivors tried to dive deep, sometimes below 200 meters, well past their design limits, but sonar pursued them with pitiless persistence. Hydrophones picked up the faint whine of compressors, the metallic creak of hulls under strain. ASDIC operators smirked grimly when they saw the rising Doppler shift on their screens. It meant the enemy was ascending, out of air or willpower. Then came the final hammer of depth charges, rolling through the water in methodical patterns until debris surfaced. Dönitz received the coded reports. Shark group engaged. Losses severe. He refused to believe it at first. For years, he had spoken of the decisive phase, convinced that faith and training would overcome Allied science. But as May turned to June, the decisive phase had arrived, and it was annihilation. The statistics tell their own truth. In May 1943 alone, the Atlantic claimed nearly a quarter of the entire operational U-boat fleet. Yet more terrifying than the losses themselves was the psychological inversion that came with them. Crews sailing from the fortified bases of Lorient and Brest now avoided eye contact with outgoing patrols. The sailors of one returning boat, U-223, later recalled the silence on shore as they docked. No band, no cheers, only the echo of boots on concrete. They had survived, but the myth of invincibility had drowned somewhere off Greenland. For the Allies, this shift in fortune did not come by chance. It was the product of cumulative adaptation, faster code breaking from Bletchley Park, more efficient convoys, radar-equipped air cover, and most of all, seasoned crews who had learned that patience, not aggression, won the undersea hunt. Creeping attacks allowed them to keep constant sonar contact, their destroyers moving almost imperceptibly until the final strike. Many crews reported hearing faint German voices over the hydrophones, men shouting or praying as their submarines collapsed under the weight of water. These were the sounds of a war losing breath. Back in Germany, Dönitz convened emergency conferences with his senior officers. Engineers presented blueprints of new miracle weapons, the snorkel tube, the Type XXI submarine with its streamlined hull and longer underwater range. They were promises written against time itself. Every new model would take months to deploy, and by then, the Allies would already dominate both surface and sky. In the words of one Kriegsmarine officer, "The Atlantic is no longer our ocean." That admission, unspoken but understood, was the deepest fracture of all. Still, some refused to spare. They convinced themselves Black May was an anomaly, the fortune of a single unlucky month. But the sonar pings that now haunted every voyage proved otherwise. They were no longer warnings. They were sentences. The hunters had become the hunted, and the oceans themselves had turned hostile. The first act of that reversal had merely shown what was possible. The second act would prove it was irreversible. The collapse that began in May 1943 did not happen in silence. It unfolded through the grinding noise of propellers, the fractured rhythm of sonar, and the fragile breathing of men trapped in iron-pressure hulls. For U-boat crews, the ocean had become an immense, resonant prison. From the Bay of Biscay to the Greenland approaches, Allied patrols scoured sea lanes day and night. The once concealed wolf packs were hunted systematically. Destroyer groupings, support groups under Captain Frederick Walker and others, were freed from convoy escort duty to roam the Atlantic as strike teams. They chased single sonar contacts for days, sometimes exhausting entire squadrons of ships to finish one submarine. They were patient hunters because they knew the mathematics. Germany had a finite number of trained crews, and every boat lost could not be easily replaced. One of those confrontations defined the new era. In June 1943, the U-202, commanded by Hans-Heinz Linder, attempted to penetrate the convoy route in the mid-Atlantic. Caught mid-evening by the sonar of the British destroyer HMS Starling, commanded by Captain Walker, the engagement lasted 18 hours. Walker's ships rotated in and out, maintaining contact through sonar even as rough weather battered their beams. Linder drove his submarine down to 230 meters, beyond its test depth. Inside, gauges shattered, insulation buckled, and the lights flickered out. Men gagged on stale air, gripping pipes as the hull flexed under pressure. Each sonar ping sounded like it was coming from inside the skull. When the U-boat finally broke the surface, crippled, the Starling's guns finished it. Survivors clung to rafts while the British ships resumed patrol. The ocean swelled over diesel oil and floating wreckage. Such scenes became standard. The Allies had shifted from defense to extermination. The sonar ping, once an uncertain instrument, was now a language of control. Operators could gauge distance and bearing with uncanny accuracy, adjusting depth charges through simple arithmetic. Sonic discipline had replaced guesswork. Even in darkness or fog, sound had made the invisible visible. In contrast, U-boat skippers described their world as the Black Tunnel. Wireless silence prevented them from sharing intelligence. Their once coordinated wolf packs were blind fish, each fighting alone. Reports from command centers in Montreal grew chaotic. Where once neat typewritten victory lists spread across desks, now only casualty notices piled up. Morale sank with every patrol. Even Dönitz, who had risen to commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine after Admiral Ritter's resignation, knew the war at sea was collapsing. At his nightly briefings, markers on the Atlantic chart no longer moved forward. The red pins denoting past kills glared like nostalgia. The blue pins of Allied convoys cluttered every route. The silence from missing boats haunted his office like ghosts of steel. Desperation birthed innovation. The snorkel, allowing submarines to run diesel engines while submerged, appeared in limited numbers. Yet Allied radar detected even the tiny mass protruding above the surface. The Type XXI, the so-called electric boat, would later prove decades ahead of its time, capable of true underwater endurance. But in 1943, it was still blueprint and promise. while the existing fleet drowned in the meantime. There was no corner of the Atlantic left untouched by the chase. In the Bay of Biscay, where U-boats once surfaced confidently to transit from bases to deep water, RAF Coastal Command aircraft now patrolled wide sectors. With radar and depth bombs, they transformed the bay into a killing ground. German crews began departing only by night, creeping near the seafloor until they reached open sea. Even then, escort planes awaited. What had once been the dangerous beginning of a patrol became the most perilous passage of all. By autumn, Dönitz ordered a temporary withdrawal from the North Atlantic convoy lanes, a tacit admission that the Corps campaign had failed. He blamed Allied radar, superior shipbuilding, even bad weather, but deep down, his diaries reveal resignation. The enemy has seized the initiative. We must wait for new weapons, new hope. The transformation was absolute. Allied sailors, once haunted by unseen torpedoes, now stood on decks watching oil fire burn for miles. In every port, from Liverpool to Halifax, news of sunken submarines lifted morale. At sea, sonar operators began marking confirmed kills with chalk stars on control panels. The abyss had flipped allegiance. And yet, even in defeat, the U-boat war left its mark on men who fought it. Many Allied sailors confessed later that after hundreds of listening hours, they could still hear phantom pings long after returning home. The sound etched itself into memory, a reminder that mastery over the sea had come at terrible cost. The climax of detection had arrived. The Atlantic battlefield was not silent, but saturated with echoes of conquest and ruin. Next came the reckoning. What remained of the U-boat arm, the psychological debris of thousands lost, and the way sonar, one invention among many, reshaped naval warfare forever. When the ocean finally grew quiet, it was a silence weighted with the ghosts of men and machines. The U-boat arm that Adolf Hitler once hailed as the decisive weapon of victory had been bled to exhaustion. Black May had broken its spine. The months that followed fractured its spirit. In June 1943, Karl Dönitz made the most reluctant decision of his career. He ordered the withdrawal of the majority of U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. It was not a surrender, he insisted, merely a reorganization of strategy. Behind the euphemism was despair. The North Atlantic was simply too lethal. Too many destroyer groups, too many patrol aircraft, too many sonar beams threading through every layer of water. Some U-boats were reassigned to secondary theaters, the Arctic convoys to Murmansk, the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, but the heyday was over. The numbers speak plainly. From 1940 through early 1943, U-boats had sunk more than 14 million tons of Allied shipping. Yet in the single year after May 1943, that figure plummeted by 2/3, while losses multiplied. By war's end, Germany had commissioned 1,162 submarines. Of those, 784 would never return. More than 28,000 sailors, 3/4 of the U-boat force, died at sea. It was a mortality rate unmatched by any other branch of either side's military. The survivors came home to half-flooded bases and silent cities. The massive concrete pens at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle, once resounding with sirens and marching bands, became mausoleums of wet rust. Crews walked among dismantled torpedoes, stepping over fishnets of debris, listening for comrades who would never emerge from the deep. Some stared at the Atlantic from the quays, whispering that they could still hear Allied sonar in the waves. The technological lessons were immediate. German engineers, rushing against time, pushed forward the Type XXI and XEI submarines, prototypes of a new generation that would shape post-war navies for decades. Their innovations, streamlined hulls, heavy battery capacity, and snorkels, would influence every submarine design that followed, including those of the victorious Allies. But for all its brilliance, it came too late to save the men already lost. For the Allies, the aftermath was triumph tempered by fatigue. The Battle of the Atlantic had stretched across almost the entire war, claiming over 70,000 Allied seamen and merchant sailors. The price of survival had been staggering. Each convoy victory carried the memory of ships gone down, of screams beneath storm clouds. Ironically, for many sonar operators and destroyer crews, triumph carried its own haunting. Men spoke in pubs later of hearing the after ping, a sound in the ear that never left even in silence. The constant tension of standing over a sonar station, waiting for that echo, had etched the rhythm deep in their nerves. Strategically, the Allied victory at sea opened the gateway to invasion. With Atlantic supply lines secure, the United States and Britain could mass tonnage and troops for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy in June 1944. Every tank, jeep, and ration tin that crossed the ocean did so under the protection won by sonar, radar, and the burnout endurance of escort crews. For Dönitz, even promotion to successor of Hitler in the final days could not disguise his defeat at sea. In his memoirs, he would claim that U-boat losses had been the inevitable consequence of overwhelming Allied resources, but privately he admitted that science, not quantity, had sealed the fate of his fleet. In docks across Britain, sailors chalked on warehouse walls, "No more shadows beneath the sea." For the first time since 1939, merchant captains steamed across the Atlantic with lights on their bridges instead of blackout shades. The ocean seemed wider again. Yet the quiet after the storm was deceptive, for behind the surface calm lay the lessons that would shape navies and nations to come. Sonar had not only conquered fear, it had redefined the relationship between man and the mysterious deep. The second phase of the aftermath would deal not with victory, but with memory, the psychological wreckage of those who had lived through the undersea war. When the guns fell silent, another war continued, an invisible one waged inside the minds of those who had survived the depths. Beneath the statistics and the grand strategies, the true legacy of the U-boat campaign was written in sleepless nights, in dreams haunted by sonar echoes that never stopped reverberating. For surviving German submariners, captivity often came with relief more than shame. Rescued from broken boats or lifeboats, they were astonished to discover how completely the tide had turned. In Allied interrogation centers, they saw maps of the Atlantic dotted with precise U-boat positions obtained from ultra-co-braking and long-range sonar triangulation. "You knew everything," one lieutenant told his British captors. He sounded not angry, but weary. The mystery that had once protected them was gone. The sea had become transparent. Back home, post-war Germany treated its submariners with uneasy respect. They were both heroes and reminders of a disastrous faith in technology's triumph. Monuments at Kiel and Hamburg began to carry not slogans but silences, epitaphs for the 30,000 young men who had vanished under black water. Their brothers and sons rarely spoke of them. It was said that the sea had taken not only their bodies, but the words to describe what had happened. Among Allied veterans, victory brought no simple closure. ASDIC operators who'd spent years bent over headphones found themselves instinctively tensing at any repetitive tone. In pubs along Liverpool's docks, old sailors joked about phantom pings in their ears, but the joke carried unease. They knew those rhythmic sounds had once meant death, just as surely as the sight of a periscope once had. For all sides, sonar had become more than a machine. It was memory made mechanical, a reminder that perception had finally surpassed courage. After the war, British and American navies immediately began refining the system into sonobuoys, an active variable-depth sonar, carrying the legacy into the Cold War. The next competition of stealth and detection, American submarines and Soviet hunter-killers, would arise directly from the lessons learned between 1939 and 1945. The undersea world would never again be the blind expanse it had once been. In the political aftermath, Dönitz's trial at Nuremberg was brief but telling. He defended the U-boat war as necessary and professional, arguing that his men had fought according to the laws of the sea. Perhaps they had. Yet the tribunal recognized another truth. Technological progress had outpaced the old notions of chivalry. Combat beneath the waves no longer allowed gestures of mercy. When a contact appeared on sonar, there was no negotiation, no signaling of surrender, only mathematics and physics deciding life or death. Even for the victors, this mechanization of war felt sobering. The West's growing mastery of detection symbolized more than progress. It foreshadowed an age in which the enemy would always be visible, and killing increasingly efficient. The ping that once promised safety now carried the uncomfortable echo of that realization. In ports once feared, Allied envoys walked safely again. Merchants sailed with confidence, bringing food and fuel to a continent starved by years of blockade. But somewhere beneath every channel-marking buoy lay the twisted hulks of hundreds of submarines, still resting where they had fallen. Coral and rust have softened their edges, but the silence down there remains heavy. Metal remembers sound differently. It vibrates faintly even now, historians say, when sonar waves from passing ships reach them. The ghosts of that war answer faintly, still stitched to the noise that once ended them. The cost had been beyond calculation, not only in tonnage or technology, but in the human psyche. Beneath victory's surface floated the truth that the Battle of the Atlantic had turned men into instruments of the machines they commanded. And yet, from those depths, the fear, the innovation, the endurance, rose a new era of understanding about oceans and ourselves. That realization would form the quiet epilogue of this long and brutal duel between sound and silence. The undersea war was never only about torpedoes, steel, or strategy. It was about human beings wrestling with the unknown. Beneath the waves, courage and terror shared the same narrow space, and progress became inseparable from fear. By the end of the Second World War, the Battle of the Atlantic had done more than secure victory. It had redefined how humanity looked at the ocean itself. What was once an abyss of mystery had become a realm mapped by sound. The Allies' sonar had pierced not only the darkness of the sea, but also the illusion that human instinct alone could prevail in modern war. The mechanical ping, so simple, so precise, announced the beginning of the scientific battlefield, a place where victory favored those who mastered waves, numbers, and patience. For the U-boat men who once believed themselves invisible, it was revelation through suffering. They learned that even silence has an echo, that the sea hears everything, and that courage sometimes means enduring, not conquering. Many never returned to tell of it, but the few who did spoke with a strange calmness. They had looked into the world's last darkness, and heard it talk back. For the sailors who hunted them, triumph brought no jubilation, only a deeper respect for the vast, merciless intelligence of nature and the fragility of those who navigate it. The sonar ping saved ships and lives, but it also reminded humanity that every technological light casts a darker shadow. Time has softened the iron and washed the salt from the decks, but the echoes remain. Each time a modern sonar sweeps through the Atlantic, its waves pass over sunken hulls that once trembled at that very sound. The ocean replies with faint vibrations, like a memory stirred but never erased. In those waves lies the legacy of an age when men fought not only against enemies, but against the infinite. The story of the U-boats and the sonar that unmade them endures as proof that in war, knowledge is never merely power, it is also the measure of what we lose when we learn too well.